Hey guys, go ahead and get comfortable. Maybe grab some tea, or that weird medieval style goblet you ordered off Etsy and never used. Tonight, we're going to drift back in time softly, slowly into the long corridors of history, where queens once wore crowns made of regret and rubies. Because tonight's story isn't about glory or conquest. It's about what happened after the battles ended, after the king was gone, after the crown hit the floor. This one's called What Happened to the Wives of Fallen Kings. And as usual, it's not quite what you'd expect. Let's start with the familiar image. A royal woman, standing by a window in a drafty castle, staring out at some distant storm. Her husband, the king, has just lost everything: a war, a throne, Mia's head. The question is, what happens to her? Does she follow him into exile? Does she end up in a convent, praying for a man who forgot she existed? Or does she do what most people in her position quietly did: survive, in the strangest and most uncomfortable way possible? Let's float gently into our first story. We're starting in England, because of course, we are. That place has more tragic royal wives than it has rainstorms. Anne Boleyn, the headline wife. So, Anne Boleyn. You probably know her as the woman who did lose her head, literally, because her husband, Henry VIII, got bored. But let's not rush to the chopping block just yet. Before all the drama, Anne was the kind of person who thought she could change the world with charm and French manners, which, in Henry's court, was basically like showing up to a bear fight in silk slippers. She was smart, sharp, and a little too modern for her own good. And for a while, it worked. Henry fell so hard that he tore apart the entire English church system just to marry her. Because why not rewrite religious history when you're horny? But once Anne was queen, the magic kind of wore off. Turns out, being married to Henry VIII was like being on a reality show where the prize was not getting executed. When Anne failed to give him the all-important male heir, the king decided she'd bewitched him, which was Tudor code for over this. So she was arrested, accused of adultery, witchcraft, and even incest with her own brother. All of it fabricated, of course. But the real story here isn't about Anne's death, it's about what happened to her after it. Because even though she was gone, her shadow hung over that court like a bad smell of perfume and guilt. Her daughter, Elizabeth, would grow up to become one of England's greatest rulers, which must have been Henry's least favorite twist of fate. Anne, the fallen queen, became a kind of ghostly warning, a bedtime story for other royal wives. Behave, or you'll end up like Anne. Let's drift forward a few years. Henry VIII, being the overachiever of spousal turnover, gave us a whole set of examples for this theme. His next wife, Catherine Howard, followed Anne's pattern right into disaster. Another young, ambitious woman, their accusation of adultery, another execution. It's almost rhythmic, really. Henry would marry, grow paranoid, and then turn on his wife like a malfunctioning Tudor washing machine. But one of his wives actually managed to survive him, Anne of Cleves. She's the one everyone forgets, because she's the queen who didn't die. Anne of Cleves, the queen who outsmarted the system. Anne of Cleves was brought to England as part of a diplomatic arrangement. Henry had seen her portrait painted by Hans Holbein and thought she was beautiful. When they met in person, he apparently said she looked nothing like the picture, which is the 16th century equivalent of swiping right and then immediately regretting it. But Anne? She was fine, totally fine. When Henry decided to annul the marriage after 6 months, she didn't protest. She didn't cry. She didn't pull a dramatic Tudor meltdown. She just smiled, accepted the title of King's Sister, and lived in luxury for the rest of her life, technically divorced, but socially untouchable. She owned multiple estates, played cards, and stayed on friendly terms with Henry's children. When you think about it, Anne of Cleves might have been the smartest Tudor queen of all. She got the castle, the money, and the peace, and she didn't even have to sleep with Henry VIII. Sometimes, survival isn't about victory. It's about knowing when to say, you know what, I'm good. Now, let's leave the Tudors behind before Henry runs out of wives to behead and drift softly toward France. Because the French monarchy specialized in beautiful, doomed women. And no story of fallen queens is complete without Marie Antoinette. Marie Antoinette, the last queen. You know her name, and probably her alleged cake comment, which she never actually said. Marie Antoinette was the teenage Austrian princess married off to the awkward French prince who would become Louis XVI. She arrived in France like a glittering comet, powdered, perfumed, and completely unprepared for reality. Court life was vicious. Every move she made was gossiped about, every dress inspected, every friend analyzed. Her husband, Louis, was sweet, but socially inept. Think of him as a history book's version of nice guy energy. It took them 7 years to consummate the marriage, which, for a queen, was kind of a big deal. So Marie found other ways to entertain herself: gambling, fashion, and an elaborate circle of admirers. She built a fake peasant village at Versailles where she could play simple country girl, which, in hindsight, probably didn't help her public image. Then came the revolution, and when it did, she didn't flee. She stayed, because she thought it would all calm down eventually. Spoiler, it didn't. Her husband was executed first. Then she was put on trial, accused of everything from treason to incest. The charges were absurd, but the hatred was real. She died at 37, her powdered world crumbling into history. And yet, after all that, her image was reborn. Painters, poets, and even modern filmmakers turned her into a tragic icon, part martyr, part fashion influencer. Marie Antoinette became what Anne Boleyn had been a century earlier, a ghostly lesson about power, perception, and the impossible expectations placed on royal women. Let's move quietly north, to Scotland. Because if there's one queen whose story sounds like it was written by a moody novelist, it's Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary, Queen of Scots, the queen who couldn't catch a break. Mary's life was basically a long series of bad marriages and worse political choices. She became queen as an infant, was shipped to France as a child, and married the Dauphin, who died 2 years later. Back in Scotland, she married her cousin, Lord Darnley, who turned out to be a violent, jealous mess. Then he was mysteriously murdered, and everyone kind of assumed Mary had something to do with it. She then married the man suspected of blowing up her last husband, which, even by royal standards, is bold. Eventually, her subjects rebelled. She was forced to flee to England, seeking protection from her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I, which was, to put it mildly, a terrible idea. Elizabeth saw Mary not as a cousin, but as a rival, so she locked her up for 19 years. 19. And then, when Mary was caught plotting or being framed for plotting to overthrow her, Elizabeth had her executed. Mary died wearing red, the color of Catholic martyrdom, and her last words were prayers. Her son, James VI of Scotland, would later become James I of England, uniting the two crowns that had destroyed her. If history were poetry, that would be the sad kind that makes you stare out the window too long. Let's drift once more across the channel, back into Europe proper, to Spain, where queens were pious, patient, and perpetually miserable. Because no one did royal suffering quite like the Spanish Habsburgs. And at the center of that gloomy dynasty sits one particularly tragic figure, Juana of Castile, known forever as Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad. Juana of Castile, the queen who loved too much. Juana wasn't actually mad at first. She was just deeply in love with her husband, Philip the Handsome, who, despite the nickname, looked like a slightly melted wax statue. They were married young, and for a while, things were passionate. But Philip was, well, a Habsburg, which meant he cheated constantly and manipulated everything for power. Juana, isolated and grieving, started to unravel. She followed his coffin after his death, reportedly refusing to let it be buried. Some said she opened the casket at night just to see him. But here's the thing, much of that was probably exaggerated. The people around her wanted her out of the way. Her father, Ferdinand of Aragon, had no problem using her supposed madness as an excuse to lock her up for the next 46 years. She never ruled. She never remarried. She just faded. A queen without a crown, a wife without a husband, living in a world that decided she was easier to manage if she was broken. And that's kind of the quiet theme tonight, isn't it? Royal wives didn't just lose husbands. They lost agency. The moment their king fell to a rebellion, to a beheading, or to some scandalous mistress, their world turned upside down. They could be saints, schemers, or scapegoats, but they were never allowed to simply be women. Part 2. The queens who outlived their thrones, hey again. If you're still here, maybe curled up under a blanket, or half asleep, already good. That's exactly how these stories are meant to be heard. Slowly, softly, like a lullaby made of gossip and genealogy. Let's start with someone who's become almost symbolic of quiet endurance, the woman who waited out the most stubborn husband in English history. Our old friend, Catherine of Aragon. Catherine of Aragon, the original ex-wife. Before Anne Boleyn and all the royal chaos, there was Catherine. She was Spanish royalty, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, the power couple who funded Columbus and cleaned up medieval Spain in very dramatic ways. Catherine was married to Henry V's older brother, Arthur. He died almost immediately within months, which left Catherine a teenage widow stranded in a damp English court. For years, she lingered in limbo while her parents and the English crown argued over her dowry like she was an unclaimed parcel. Eventually, she married Henry himself, the younger brother, in what was supposed to be a fairy tale fix. And for a while, it was. Catherine was intelligent, kind, deeply pious, and she actually loved Henry. He loved her too, at least in the early years. They ruled together, jousted together, prayed together. She was even regent once, when Henry went off to war. But she couldn't give him the one thing he wanted, a living son. She gave birth multiple times, but only one child survived, a daughter, Mary. And in Henry's mind, that simply wasn't enough. He wanted a dynasty, a male heir, and the validation that came with it. So when Anne Boleyn appeared young, witty, impossible to ignore, Henry decided God must have cursed his marriage to Catherine. Naturally, his solution was to end the entire English connection to the Pope, because apparently divorce wasn't dramatic enough. Catherine was banished from court, separated from her daughter, and left to live out her days in isolated castles. She never stopped calling herself queen, never admitted the marriage was invalid. She spent her final years praying, writing letters, and quietly dying of illness while Henry married her replacement. Her last letter to him was heartbreakingly polite. She forgave him, blessed his new wife, and prayed for his soul. Henry never saw her again. Catherine's fall wasn't loud or theatrical. It was slow, the kind that seeps in through locked doors and long silences. And when she died, Henry supposedly wore yellow the next day. Some said it was mourning, others said it wasn't. Let's glide forward about 3 centuries. We're in France again, because France had a habit of making queens miserable in style. Our next queen didn't lose her head, but she did lose her crown to a younger woman and a restless emperor. Her name was Josephine de Beauharnais, and her husband was Napoleon. Empress Josephine, the rose who wilted first. Josephine had one of those lives that felt like 3 different novels mashed together. She was born in Martinique, married off young, and survived the French Revolution by barely not getting guillotined. By the time she met Napoleon Bonaparte, she was a widowed socialite with charm, debts, and exactly the kind of elegance Napoleon's upstart world adored. He was obsessed with her. He wrote letters that read like bad fan fiction, dramatic, clingy, occasionally unhinged. "I kiss your little toes," he once wrote, which is a detail no one asked for, but now you can't unhear it. When he crowned himself emperor, he made Josephine his empress. But their marriage had cracks from the start. She couldn't give him an heir. And for a man who saw himself as destiny's favorite child, that was unacceptable. So, in 1810, Napoleon divorced her, not out of hatred, but for the good of France, as he liked to say, which is always code for, found someone younger. Josephine left quietly. She retreated to her estate, Malmaison, surrounded by her beloved roses, parrots, and memories of what used to be. She stayed cordial with Napoleon, even wrote him fond letters. When he was exiled years later, he reportedly whispered her name before he died. Josephine's life was full of irony. The woman he loved most couldn't give him a son, and the woman who did never captured his heart. So in a way, she won the long game. She got to be the romantic ghost haunting Napoleon's legend. Now, let's drift even farther east to Russia, a colder place, in every sense, where royal wives didn't just lose their husbands, they lost entire worlds. Enter Alexandra Romanov. Alexandra Romanov, the last empress. If Catherine of Aragon was the first quiet exile, Alexandra was the last. She was the Empress of Russia, wife to Tsar Nicholas II, the final ruler of the Romanov dynasty. At first glance, their life looked like a fairy tale: golden palaces, jeweled crowns, children dressed like porcelain dolls. But beneath it all was a ticking clock. Alexandra wasn't Russian by birth, she was a German princess. Shy, devout, and prone to nervous exhaustion. She married Nicholas for love, which, in royal history, is already a red flag. They adored each other, but Russia did not adore her. She was seen as cold, foreign, and dangerously religious. Then came the tragedy of her only son, Alexei, who suffered from hemophilia. Alexandra was desperate to save him, and that desperation led her into the orbit of one of history's strangest characters, Rasputin. You know the name, the unwashed mystic, who claimed he could heal her son through prayer and sheer weirdness. He gained her absolute trust, and by extension, immense influence. And of course, the more people saw him at court, the more they despised her. By the time World War I hit, the Russian people were starving, the army was broken, and everyone blamed Alexandra, the German witch. When the revolution finally came, Nicholas abdicated. The royal family was arrested and sent into exile, first in palaces, then in smaller houses, and eventually to a basement in Yekaterinburg. You know what happened there. But before that final night, Alexandra spent her captivity writing letters, praying, teaching her daughters to sew. Her tone was calm, even gentle, as though she had already stepped outside of time. There's something hauntingly peaceful about her last months. She went from the most powerful woman in the empire to just a mother, holding her children close while the world disintegrated around her. And maybe that's why her story lingers, not as a political tragedy, but as a human one. Let's drift a little farther down the timeline, towards smaller kingdoms and quieter collapses. Because not every fallen queen ended in fire and revolution. Some simply faded, like Queen Marie of Romania, who watched her country collapse after the First World War. Or Queen Soraya of Iran, dismissed because she couldn't produce an heir, her fairy tale marriage turning into a sad newspaper headline. Or Queen Isabella II of Spain, who was forced into exile and lived long enough to see the monarchy restored. Without her, history's footnotes are crowded with these women, wives of kings who lost, fell, or simply got bored. They were shuffled aside, rewritten, or quietly erased, depending on what version of the story survived. And yet, in their downfall, they became something powerful. A mirror. The wives of fallen kings show us that power, even the glittering kind, is always temporary. A queen could rule nations one day and be forgotten the next, her name surviving only in dusty letters or embroidered linens tucked in a museum case. But here's the strange comfort. Most of them adapted. They prayed, they painted, they hosted salons. They raised children who would one day take thrones again. The crown was never really theirs, but dignity was. And that, in history's sleepy twilight, is its own kind of crown. Let's stay in this quiet place a little longer, because there are still more queens, more wives, more women who learned to survive the fall. Part 3. Queens who wouldn't go quietly. Hey again. If you're still awake, you're doing better than most of the kings in this story. Let's just keep gliding through the centuries softly. No sudden movements, because the next few royal marriages fell apart in slow motion, the way old chandeliers come down one crystal at a time. Caroline of Brunswick, the unwanted wife. England again, because apparently that island never runs out of marital disasters. Caroline of Brunswick was imported to marry George of, a man who looked like every pastry he ever ate. When he first met her, he reportedly called for brandy. She thought he smelled like a stale perfume shop. So, romantic beginnings. They married anyway. There was duty, money, and the vague hope that they'd at least manage an heir. They did, barely. A daughter named Charlotte. Then George walked out and tried to pretend his wife didn't exist. For years Caroline lived abroad, collecting small dogs, rumors, and scandalous friendships. George kept throwing parties with other women and pretending she died. When he finally became king, Caroline came back to London like the world's most awkward RSVP. She wanted her crown. He wanted her gone. Parliament held a public trial to strip her of the title, complete with witnesses, gossip, and more innuendo than an 1819 tabloid could handle. The people, of course, sided with Caroline. Nothing unites a crowd like hating a spoiled monarch. She technically won, but the coronation door was literally slammed in her face. She died soon after, probably of stomach illness, maybe of humiliation. England moved on, but for a while, pubs sold mugs with her face on them, and women toasted her name. A small, sleepy victory against royal nonsense. Christina of Sweden, the queen who quit. Let's float north, where winters are long and monarchs get philosophical. Christina of Sweden was raised to rule brilliant, eccentric, allergic to normal expectations. She read Descartes, collected art, and decided marriage was overrated. So one morning in 1654, she gathered her court, thanked them politely, and abdicated. She just stopped being queen. Everyone thought she'd gone mad. But Christina wasn't falling from a throne, she was stepping off it before it crushed her. She moved to Rome, converted to Catholicism, wore men's clothes, and spent the rest of her life debating theology and ignoring gossip. In a story full of queens who were pushed out, she's the rare one who walked. Her fall was self-inflicted, peaceful, maybe even liberating. If history were a bedtime story, Christina would be the chapter where the heroine finally gets a nap. Louise of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, the sainted queen, now to Prussia, cold palaces, rigid etiquette, and a woman who somehow melted it a little. Louise married King Frederick William III. She was young, graceful, terrifyingly polite. When Napoleon invaded, she became a symbol of national virtue, writing letters, comforting soldiers, pleading with the French emperor himself. He called her the only man in Prussia, which was both insult and compliment. After the defeat, she aged overnight. She died at 34, worn out by childbirth and war. Her husband mourned for the rest of his life. The Prussians canonized her in sentiment. So she's the opposite of our earlier queens, beloved in death instead of blamed. Still tragic. Still gone too soon. Marie Antoinette's shadow sisters. Let's slide back to France for a moment, because Versailles had more doomed women than chandeliers. After Marie Antoinette came Marie Therese Charlotte, her daughter, the only one to survive the revolution. She was imprisoned as a teenager, released years later, and married a cousin she didn't particularly like. She lived long enough to see multiple regimes rise and fall, each promising to restore her family's honor, each failing. She never smiled much. Who could blame her? Then there was Empress Eugenie, wife of Napoleon I, a 19th century echo of Josephine. She adored fashion, built palaces, and lost everything when the empire collapsed in 1870. She lived in exile in England until 1920, haunting tea parties with old world charm and quiet grief. Eugenie outlived her husband and son. Sometimes survival is the cruelest endurance test. Queens in the rearview. By the late 1800s, royal wives had better odds of keeping their heads, but not their thrones. The age of divine right was fading. The age of constitutional irrelevance had arrived. Queen Amelie of Portugal fled a revolution in disguise. Queen Ranavalena III of Madagascar was shipped off to Algeria when France decided her island would make a nice colony. And Empress Zita of Austria watched her empire disintegrate in 1918, packed her 8 children, and wandered Europe for decades, insisting she was still empress of something. Most of them ended up teaching languages, writing memoirs, or gardening. Royal bloodlines turn out to be surprisingly adaptable when faced with grocery bills. If you're still with me, maybe you're breathing slowed a bit, eyes getting heavy. That's okay. These stories are meant to settle, not shock. Because behind every fallen crown is just another person trying to figure out what to do with their hands when the applause stops. Caroline drank. Christina painted. Eugenie remembered. And the world kept spinning, a little less impressed each time. Let's float one more time, toward the last cluster of royal wives who learned that thrones are temporary, but gossip is eternal. Part 4. The Last Queens, and the quiet ending. If you're still listening, we've come a long way together across empires, marriages, and more bad royal decisions than anyone could count. Let's just stay in the hush for a bit, because the last chapter of this story isn't about crowns falling, it's about what's left after. Wallis Simpson, the woman who made a king quit. The 20th century liked its scandals modern and photogenic. Wallis Simpson fit perfectly. She wasn't royal, wasn't rich, and unlike every duchess before her was divorced twice. Yet King Edward VIII fell for her with the determination of a man allergic to good advice. The government said no, the church said no, his family said absolutely not. So Edward did the only thing a stubborn Windsor could do. He abdicated. The throne went to his brother, George VI. Edward became the Duke of Windsor, and Wallis became his Duchess. At first, it sounded romantic. He gave up everything for love. But exile is a long time to be romantic in. They lived in elegant boredom, moving between villas and banquets, always slightly unwelcome. She collected jewelry. He collected regrets. When he died, she stayed in Paris, quieter and smaller each year. The queen who never was, in a house full of framed photographs of the man who'd ruined his life for her. Soraya Isfandiari Bakhtiari, the tearful queen of Iran, different continent, same heartbreak. Soraya married the Shah of Iran in the 1950s, a modern fairy tale in diamonds and desert sunlight. She was glamorous, shy, and deeply in love. But after 7 years, no children came. So the royal council decided the marriage must end. For the good of the dynasty, of course. She wept on live radio. The Shah reportedly cried too. Then she left the palace, traded tiaras for film roles, and lived out her days between Rome and Paris, half celebrity, half ghost. Soraya never remarried. When she died, alone in her apartment, neighbors found her surrounded by old photographs. A fallen queen, still posing for nobody. Farah Pahlavi, the empress in exile. Farah came after Soraya, the new empress of a modernizing Iran. She built museums, universities, charities, believed in progress with the bright optimism of the 1960s. Then the 1979 revolution arrived, and optimism packed its bags. Farah fled with her husband and children, watching her world disappear on television screens in foreign hotels. After the Shah's death, she wandered from country to country, always Her Majesty, to a shrinking circle of loyalists. Decades later, she still signs letters that way, not because she expects a throne to return, but because sometimes a title is the last piece of home you have left. Diana Spencer, the people's ghost. And then there was Diana, a princess who lived in an age of cameras instead of courtiers.